TV, the voice for humanity.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Pickering. This is Parrot TV Literary Corner. Today we have John Yamrus, and his in a career spanning more than 50 years as a working writer. John Yamrus has published 28 volumes of poetry, 2 novels, 3 volumes of nonfiction, and a children's book. He has also had more than 2,500 poems published in magazines and anthologies around the world. Selections of his work have been translated into several languages, including Spanish, Swedish, French, Japanese, Italian, Romanian, Albanian, Estonian, and Bengali. His poetry is taught in numerous colleges and universities. Thanks for joining us today, John. I hope your day is going well. You appear to be muted.
Nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you as well. So, how did you begin your writing career? I hear that's a funny story.
It's funny we should start off with that story. I always tell people that started off with a lie. Going back way back 1970, my friend and I, my best friend, we were always complaining. We wanted to be writers in the worst way, and we were always complaining. Couldn't get published here, couldn't get published there, because publishers were always saying, "Where have you been published? What awards have you won?" And we hadn't been published anywhere and hadn't won any awards. And one night, we always walked each other home. If I was at his house, he walked me home. And I was walking him home, and we were at the bottom of a bottle of vodka at the corner of Oliver and Wakefield Streets. And we were standing there. We finished off the bottle of vodka. It had to be 3 in.the.morning. And the vodka was Pop-Off vodka. I don't know if you're familiar with Pop-Off vodka, or even if they still sell it. But it was probably at that time, probably about $3.49 for a fifth. And came with a little sombrero on top. And we were complaining we couldn't get published anywhere, hadn't won any awards. And so he took a last slug of the vodka, looked up at the street sign, which happened to be Wakefield Street, and he handed me the bottle and says, "I hereby award you the Wakefield Prize." Gave me the bottle of vodka, and he turned around and walked home. The next morning, I swear to God, it's a true story. I swear to God, I wrote off to a prominent literary magazine at the time and said I was recently awarded the prestigious Wakefield Prize. Would you take a look at my work? I sent the stuff off that day, and weeks later, I forgot about what I had done. Weeks later, I got a letter from the editor of the magazine saying, "Got your recent letter. Yes, I'm aware that you had recently won the Wakefield Prize. Congratulations, and I'd like to publish you in our magazine." And that is a true story of how I got my foot in the door.
Quite interesting. I guess that is a lesson to some of us out there who are struggling and trying to get in. You just make up something, just invent an award out of the blue and send off, and editors don't know any better.
Since that time, I haven't been offered or won or anything, any kind of awards, and I never really worked or strived for that kind of recognition, but it's the way I got my foot in the door.
Interesting story. I mean, that's really fascinating. A little deceit here and there doesn't hurt, I guess. And I have your book here. This is Selected Poems, published by Concrete Mist Press. My friend Heath Broker is actually the I guess you could call it the entrepreneur behind the mind behind that press. And I've been in his anthologies a couple of times, I guess. And it's a wonderful little book. How would you describe your poetic style? I've heard the phrase postmodern minimalism. What is that? And how does that factor into your work?
I don't know. That's a whole mouthful of words to describe what little I do. What I've always let me back up. I won't say always. When I started out, I was even younger and stupider than I am now. I had in the last 3 decades, I've always tried to keep things simple. I didn't strive to write any kind of big poem, any big statements. What I wanted to do was shine the light on the little teeny stupid things in life. Picking up dog poop in the yard, fighting that hair on your nose that continues to grow back. I wanted to shine the light on those little everyday moments, and I wanted my work to add up, one poem after another, to accumulate, and I wanted that to be my big poem, the whole work.
That's interesting. So it's more about the body of work than any individual poem.
For sure. I don't know if you're familiar with the old character actor Walter Brennan. Walter Brennan was in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of movies back in the 40s and 50s, and I always envied that. He was just a guy who showed up and did the work, and that's the way I see my position as a writer. I see myself as a lunch pail kind of guy who shows up and does the work without any flash and no flash.
Just gets it done. Just puts it out there. And I mean, do you ever look back on what you've done and kind of contemplated? I mean, maybe what you could have done differently, or are you pretty content with what you've produced?
I don't have any regrets. I'm always trying to move forward. And you said you look back on the volume of your work, and it's funny. You talked about how I've had roughly 2,500 pieces published over the years, and during those days when I used to give live appearances at colleges and things like that, and those things are going to start to open up again soon. When whoever was introducing me would say, John has published 2,500 poems in magazines, people would always kind of almost audibly gasp. And that always seemed funny to me because of my lunch pail type of attitude. All that was just accomplished one poem, one day, one line at a time. And that was very important to me to just show up and do the work. I was never one to sit back and wait for inspiration. I did the work, and if inspiration or something good happened, that was fine. But I showed up and continue to show up every day and do the work.
Yeah, that's definitely a good work ethic. It's possible that the more projections you accumulate, the more acceptance you get, the more attention you're gathering and momentum you're gathering as a writer, the more you get your work out there, even if it's not being published necessarily. I would advise writers out there listening in that, if you're getting rejected a lot, that just means your work is getting out there and people are reading it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad quality. Go ahead.
That's a very good point. I always tell young aspiring writers that rejection is just put in your way to weed out the unwilling.
Right.
That you got to be willing to take a couple of shots, or take a lot of shots to succeed. And the only people who succeed are the ones that are too stupid or too stubborn to give up. And I'm one of those too.
Possibly both. Who knows? Maybe both are a good combination.
Yeah.
So, in your lectures at universities and your poetry is taught at universities, what do you think students can learn or are learning from your work?
What I hope people pick up is that you don't have to say the whole thing. The tendency for aspiring writers and bad writers is to try to say everything, to show how flashy and talented they are. My big aha moment for me as a writer, and I know the poem something like 17 words. The poem that taught me that you don't have to say everything. My big moment, the poem went like this. Write a poem about that, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed, smiling. And that's the poem. And years ago, when I was younger, when I was stupider, before I figured it out, I would have continued the poem. I would have described the bed. I would have described the room. I would have attempted to describe what that was. And when I finished that poem, it hit me. I realized that the reader's imagination is much more powerful and talented than anything I could say as a writer. And once I realized that the picture that the reader was coming up with in their head was the whole poem, and it was already done for me, man, I was off to the races. That was my job was done. And once I realized you don't have to say everything, things became easy and clear for me.
Right. What's the story behind your one-word poem? That in the introduction, Mitch Murphy talks about the one-word poem "Emerge," I believe it was called. What is the story behind that, and what was some of the criticisms of why this isn't a poem, and how you've been justified over time?
Well, I don't know if I've been justified, but the one-word poem was endure.
Endure, yes.
If you back up and listen, like I've been saying, my whole attitude, my whole persona, my whole self is built on enduring, showing up and doing the work. And that poem got a lot of criticism. It got a lot of support from both sides, from people who said, you can't have one word be a poem, and other people who said, yeah, that's really cool, it works. And people in the middle who said, well, you can, but it's a matter of the choice of the word. And it's the fact that people were willing or pissed off enough to talk about it showed that yeah, maybe it was a poem. If it's not, so what? I'll be writing other things.
Yeah, I think most of the greatest figures in literature have had polarizing effects to that degree. Who are some of your favorite literary figures and personas out there who inspire you to write more?
Well, I get asked that question a lot, and there's a lot of writers that I like. I can't say they've inspired me or taught me anything. I have a few, but I've gained my biggest inspiration and biggest knowledge from people like Miles Davis, who with his music taught me worlds, taught me that it taught me the value of silence. Again, it goes back to saying as much as you can in as little as you can, in as few words. And at the end of the day, isn't that the essence of poetry? The almost a dictionary description of poetry, saying as much as you can in as few words as you can. People like that, like Miles Davis, Groucho Marx. I love the Marx Brothers. I love that snarky attitude. That's reflected in my poetry, and it informs my work. And then for writers, people like Stephen King, I know he gets a bad rap, but nobody writes a line as pure and simple and clear as Stephen King, except maybe somebody like Richard Yates, writer from the 50s. If you know his most famous novel was Revolutionary Road. And if you want to see how to write a line of dialogue, study Richard Yates. You'll be surprised.
So, what are your nonfiction books cover?
I published 3.
Mm-hmm.
One called 5 Dogs.
Mm-hmm.
That was also brought out by our friend Heath Brocker, who's he's the hardest working, kindest, sweetest soul you'd ever encounter. And he published my book, 5 Dogs. And he liked one of my earlier books called Bark, which is a collection of my my poems about dogs. And he asked me to consider doing another book of poetry about dogs. And I liked that book so much I didn't want to do another. So I thought for a while, and I wrote a prose. Well, it's kind of like a poem with a thyroid condition. Book. It's about the 5 dogs my wife and I have loved over the years, and that's also published by Concrete Mist Press. And if you look closely, turn that up. That's a picture of our dog Stella during a thunderstorm, standing scared. 58 pounds of golden doodle standing on my lap, waiting for me to save. The other 2 nonfiction books are little memoirs of what it was like growing up in a Pennsylvania coal town in the 1950s, having less money than most people, except, well, the whole neighborhood didn't have money. It was a coal mining community. And the 2 books were about what it was like growing up in the 50s, where there were 2 bars on every street and 1 church on every street. And, it was fun.
So it's pretty quiet space, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty average, I guess you could say, small town.
Yeah, those 2 books were called RMA, which was abbreviation for Remember Me Always, and Memory Lane. I also published a children's book.
Okay.
So, I always kind of avoided the term poet. For several reasons. Even though I've published 28 books of poetry over the years, I number one, don't think I'm good enough to be called a poet. Don't think I've earned the title yet. And I just don't want to be put in a box. I don't want to be labeled. If I had a label, I wouldn't feel free to write these books about my dogs, to write books about what it was like growing up in the 50s. So don't want to be labeled.
You mentioned earning the title poet. How would someone earn the title poet? How would you conceive that?
I don't know. Right now, go out in your backyard and pick up any rock. There's 5 poets fighting for space with the 5 artists. So yeah, I just didn't want to be part of that crowd. I didn't want to label myself, and I don't think you call yourself something. I think titles are given or earned.
And, yeah, I think so. You let other people kind of designate. Yeah. So speaking of poetry, would you like to share a couple of poems with us?
Okay. I really didn't want to do this because nobody wants to hear writers read their work, especially this writer.
Well, it's a good sampling opportunity, get people, sort of an idea of what you write about and what you represent.
Normally my poems are fairly short. This one is 2.5 pages, which is probably about as long-winded as I'll get. And there's a backstory, to this poem, and I'll tell you about it. Normally I don't explain my poems, but I'll tell you the backstory after I read it. It's called "And All the Sick, Perverted Bastards of the World Deserve to Die an Awful, Bloody Death." I was picking my dog up at the vet today, and while I was waiting for them to bring her out, I looked over at this big white dog on my right, and I was shocked to see it had an ear missing and part of its skull was gone. It looked like an old wound that had healed over, and I nodded at the owner and asked, "Hey man, what happened to your pooch? You get hit by a car or something?" "Nah," he said. "She's a rescue." "Rescue?" "Yeah. We found her in the road, thrown out with her ear gone and half her head torn away." "And what happened?" "The cops said they see it all the time. They figure she was raised by people who fight pit bulls. And you could tell just by looking at her that she's real sweet. And I guess when she wouldn't fight, she was probably just used." "Used? For what?" "Bait." Neither one of us said a word. I knelt down and gave her a hug and scratched her neck. And when I did, she turned real quick and gave me this great big wet sloppy kiss right on the face. "And all the sick perverted bastards of the world deserve to die an awful bloody death."
Quite a story. Is that's something that I imagine that really took place.
It really did. And the poem got picked up and posted all over the place. People from PETA posted it. In fact, it started coming back at me. Somebody sent it to me and said, "Hey, I saw this poem on PETA's site, on their blog or whatever you call it. You got to see this. You got to read this." And I read it, and it was my poem. My poem on the site. And then it ended up in my book. And months later, my wife's upstairs, I'm downstairs, and she's yelling, "John, come here, you got to see this." And I thought, man, what happened? She dropped something? She fall something? Something fall? And I run up, and that dog on the Oprah Winfrey show.
Oh, wow.
Written about. The dog was named Oogie. And there's been books written about this dog, and I kind of was one of the first people to discover and love little old Oogie. Let me read something else here.
Okay. I remind our viewers that you can comment on Facebook and ask questions. If you have any questions, just drop them on there on our Facebook here live. So feel free to do that.
This also is in selected poems. Spent the night sitting in my chair listening to this set of recordings I bought earlier in the day. Old radio shows from the 40s and 50s. Hard-boiled detectives. Philip Marlowe, Boston Blackie, Johnny Dollar. Tough guys who knew their way around a knife and a gun and a dame. Men who talked fast and walked slow. Men of wit and courage and charm. For 3 hours I listened, then, tired, I finally took one last slug of beer and walked out onto the back porch, hoping that someone would be stupid or foolish or desperate enough to try and sneak up and slug me from behind.
Interesting. What's the story behind that?
It is what it is.
Right.
The poem says exactly what it was, and there's really no story behind it other than what I just said. Let me give it. Let me back up. My poems. I intend my poems to be seen as. Imagine you're in a train speeding down the track, and you're looking out the window, and what you see is flashing past that window. And my poems are just a snapshot of that window And the reader has to imagine what else is happening
Right.
outside the window.
Okay.
Uh,
That's interesting.
that's the best explanation I can give for my poetry. Let me read this one.
Okay.
Picture this. This basement where I write is lined with books, and where there are no books, there are old DVDs of movies, and where there are no old movies, there's a refrigerator filled with beer and a cabinet filled with wine. Put in a bathroom, and I could easily live down here, but then there's the dog and the world and you.
It's a very intimate poem. I like that. Just want to do a brief advertisement for the Literary Parrot here. This is our book of global poetry and prose and visual art. So anybody out there can buy this at $18 on Amazon. It's 249 pages of glorious global literature and visual art, as I've mentioned. So feel free to take a look at it and get an idea of what the New York Parrot is about. We'd love to have our viewers right now take a look at that on Amazon, or and maybe a little bit later in the day if you want to look it up. The Literary Parrot Series 1. Series 2 will be available on December 2nd. So, John, I'm curious, who is Mitch Murphy? It's a longtime friend who wrote the introduction to selected poems. What is the story behind your meeting him, and what was sort of the bonding experience?
That's she and I go back a couple of years. I was looking at the time for someone to illustrate my children's book. And I don't know how many artists you've dealt with over the years, but artists can be finicky, crazy, odd, just by the nature of what they do. And working on this children's book, we had people who wanted too much money up front. They wanted everything. And for one reason or another, one of the illustrators who was working on the book just flat out disappeared. I'm not lying. The guy did 10, 12 illustrations for the book and went dark on us. And so then I was on Facebook and put out this thing saying I was looking for someone with the right attitude and the right feel for this book. And Mish introduced herself. And we talked a little bit back and forth, and something just felt right. Something clicked. And I was right. I took a leap of faith, and she did some great illustrations for this children's book I put out. And since then, she's done the design and covers for a few of my books, and she did the editing for selected poems. And with that in mind, the publisher wanted me to pick my own poems, and I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to work with an editor. I wanted the book to be seen through the eyes of a reader. And what better reader could I have than Eileen Mitch Murphy? And she and I fought back and forth for 2 months picking the poems for the book. We ended up with 380 some pages worth of the best of what we feel are the best of my books, my 34 whatever books from over the years.
Did she have a sort of criteria that she worked with, or did she just sort of choose by taste what poem she thought?
We went through each book. She did and I did. We went through each book. We each made lists, and we combined the lists. We looked at them. If a poem was on both lists, it automatically made the book. If a poem was on one or the other list, it went on a B list. then we fought about them. And so we had our A list and our B list, and then we had almost a C list. So it was a real process putting the thing together. And I've always felt that my books, the poetry, should have a real beginning, middle, and end to them. And since I didn't want to come up with that beginning, middle, and end, and I didn't want the books to be chronological. That was too boring, too stupid. I didn't want them to be done by subject. That was too boring, too stupid. I didn't want all my noir poems. I didn't want all my poems about the literary life. I didn't want all my poems about dogs together. So it presented Eileen with a real problem, and she solved it very well. Very happy with the book.
It's excellent. I've read through some of the work in the book, and I appreciate the style and the output there. I find it fascinating. It's interesting, and the cover. I love the cover art. It's very intriguing. You know, just looking at the cover, it's beautiful. It's everything from the lettering to the art itself. Very interesting looking book, and it's a nice thick volume of poetry. It's as you said, gives you imaginative capacities to sort of think about what's been going on in it and what you're feeling as a poet or as a writer in the book, you know. And also at the same time, you know, you're presented with something tangible to work with to let your imagination flow. There's a very nice little collection of large collection of work that spans. How many years does this span, do you think?
Well, my first book came out in 1970.
Okay.
I'd say the book spans, at least 40 of those 51 years. Maybe, yeah, 40 years at least. And I'm happy to have reached the point where I have a body of work to present, something to look on. In no way does that mean I've reached that point where I'm ready to give up or stop. Old habits die hard, just like old writers. And I guess I've got both and am both.
Right. So what are we have about 8 minutes left. What are some interesting comments you've heard about your work that stuck out to you as a writer? You know, somebody say something interesting that you're just kind of like, I would have never thought of it that way.
Usually I don't even think about those kind of things. I can't worry about that. I do the work and put it out there, and if people like it, that's fine. If I started writing for the comments and for the way it was received, then I'd get ahead of myself. And that's the same way that I write, the way I work. If I sit down with the thought that I'm going to start at point A and I want to get to point Z, it's crap. Usually what I write is crap.
Me too.
I get informed to take my inspiration from jazz musicians who live in the moment. I want the poem to speak to me and teach me and tell me where to go and where I've been. It's just old habits, and it is a habit. If you're one of those aspiring writers who wants to wait for inspiration, you're fooling yourself. Don't wait for inspiration. Do the work, and do the work.
Right. So I'd like to hear what your final advice and sentiments would be for our viewers and writers out there who are maybe struggling with their craft or looking for some sort of direction, or maybe just want to hear what other writers have to say.
Well, I've run into writers who say I don't read anybody because I don't want to mess with my own gift. That's BS.
Yes.
Read as you can. You gotta number one, you got to know what the competition is up to. You got to know what the whole world around you is doing. You got to read what happened in the past. You got to be very familiar with the classics. Yeah, and you can't give up on the classics. You can't say, oh, I tried that stuff when I was in my 20s and it was junk. Go back to it. There's reasons why they're classics. So I always tell aspiring writers, you gotta, it goes back to doing the work, and part of the work is being aware of what else is around you in whatever field you want to be. I mean, if you want to be a painter, you got to know about Picasso and Braque and all those people. So you don't exist in a vacuum.
So are there any friends, family, supporters that you'd like to thank?
The only one I like to thank and have to thank and want to thank is my wife, because she's put up with me for 46 years and encouraged the right. She doesn't go to my readings. Those occasions when I do readings, for the main reason because when I do a reading, I feel self-conscious. I start playing to her. I look for her response, and I screw up. So she doesn't go to my readings. She hasn't gone in decades to any of my readings. And we're both good with that. Number one, because she'd be bored, and number two, because I'd screw up.
Right. Well, thank you for joining us today, John. It's been pleasant talking with you. I hope you keep writing and keep creating some interesting material, and we'll see maybe another volume in the near future from you. This is Dustin Pickering. Sure. Absolutely. I love seeing new writing from writers that have been around a while and seeing what they have to say. So it's wonderful to be talking with you today. And thanks to Heath Broger for submitting your information, or submitting us to you, getting you in touch with us. So it's been an interesting conversation. This is the New York Parrot Literary Corner. I'm Dustin Pickering, and this is our literary anthology, The Literary Parrot. Again, if you have not seen this book or purchased a copy, I advise you to do so. It's $18, 249 pages of excellent creative writing and visual art. So don't be afraid. Just go out and take a look at it, and tell us what you think, and drop some comments there on about our program here live. When we're on, just tell us what you're thinking, what kind of questions you may have. We want to hear from you as our audience, and we thank our viewers today. We thank John as well for joining us, and I am very pleased to have spoken with you. And just keep out there in the writing communities. Everybody just keep doing what you're doing best. And as John said, read. Don't just write, read. To cultivate your craft, you have to know what's been before you, not existing in a vacuum, as John said very well. So this is Dustin Pickering at the Literary Corner in New York Parrot, and I'm signing off. Have an excellent afternoon.
Parrot TV, the voice for humanity.